Midway, a small town nestled in the northern stretch of Minnesota, moved slowly in the heart of winter. January wrapped everything in a soft, muffled silence, and the frozen river that split the town in two had become part of the landscape, immovable, endless, and white. Trees stood bare along the banks, their limbs gloved in snow. Houses creaked under the weight of icicles, and the roads had turned to pale ribbons of compacted frost. Life in Midway didn't stop in winter, but it did learn to whisper. On the third morning of the new year, just after dawn, brushed a pale light over the woods, Henry Harris stepped onto the frozen surface of the river. He was a retired factory worker, a quiet man in his 60s, now spending his days fishing, walking, and tending to the things nobody else noticed anymore. He moved carefully, using a long stick to test the ice ahead of him, the way his father had taught him decades ago. The cold stung his cheeks and filled his lungs, but he didn't mind. This was his season. He was halfway across the wide, frozen current when something caught his eye. A dark shape sat on the ice, out of place in the expanse of white. At first, he thought it was a discarded coat or maybe a piece of canvas blown from the shoreline. But as he neared, the shape shifted slightly. It trembled. It was a puppy, a German shepherd, no older than 6 months, its fur dusted with frost, its ears drooping, its tail curled tightly around its body. One side of the animal's body was darkened with blood, not fresh, but frozen stiff. The pup didn't lift its head or bark. It simply lay there, shivering, too cold and weak to flee. Henry didn't speak. He just knelt, removed his outer coat, and wrapped it around the limp body. The pup was lighter than he expected, fragile. He could feel the tremors through the fabric. Without another look, he rose, carrying the small weight against his chest, and retraced his path across the river. Back at his cabin, Henry placed the puppy near the heater, layered towels over it, and called the local animal rescue. While waiting, he cleaned the wound as best he could with warm water and antiseptic, whispering apologies each time the pup flinched. The dog's eyes never closed. They stared up at him, wary, tired, and unblinking. The rescue team arrived an hour later. They examined the puppy and said he'd likely survive. They offered to take him, but Henry hesitated. He looked at the bundle in his coat and then at the van idling in his driveway. Something in him settled. He told them he'd foster the dog for now. He didn't have a name for the pup. Not yet. But something had already shifted between them, a kind of quiet pact. The river had frozen, but something warm had surfaced. In the stillness of that January morning, Henry knew the dog hadn't just been left behind. He had been waiting, and now he was no longer alone. They named the puppy Nico. He spent his first night in warmth, curled under a heat lamp, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. A slow IV drip fed into his front leg, and his breathing, while shallow, began to find a rhythm. The veterinarian had come late in the evening, stepping through the snow with a black bag and tired eyes. After a careful examination, he had nodded once and quietly said that Nico would make it. Henry Harris had lived alone for over a decade. His wife had passed from illness, his children lived far away, and most days he moved between the cabin, the river, and the grocery store without speaking to more than 2 people. But sometimes, on weekends or school breaks, his niece, Rachel, would visit with her son. The boy's name was Lucas. Lucas was 8 years old. A small, solemn child with pale skin and dark hair that always looked slightly uncombed. Since the fire that took his father nearly a year ago, he hadn't spoken a single word. There had been therapy, gentle books, patient teachers, nothing. He wasn't angry or wild, just silent, as though whatever engine made words come had simply shut off. When Rachel brought him to the cabin that week, she had warned Henry that Lucas might keep to himself, that he might not even notice the new dog. But she was wrong. Lucas saw Nico the moment they stepped into the living room. The puppy was curled beside the wood stove, still weak, his sides rising and falling slowly. He didn't move when they entered. Lucas didn't say anything. He simply slipped off his backpack, crossed the room, and sat against the opposite wall. Nico didn't flinch. He didn't lift his head. He only blinked once, long and heavy. Minutes passed. Lucas kept his distance. He didn't reach out. He didn't make a sound. He just watched, his knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped loosely around them. Nico stirred a little, then, as if sensing something shift in the air, turned his head. Their eyes met. Neither blinked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But in that moment, something subtle and wordless was exchanged between boy and dog. An understanding born not from speech, but from shared quiet. Nico's ears twitched. Lucas's fingers curled a little tighter around his knees. That was all. But the next morning, Lucas returned to the same spot. He sat in the same way, just a little closer. Nico opened his eyes when the boy entered, lifted his head slightly, and let it rest again. The day after, Lucas came again, closer still. He didn't try to pet the dog. He didn't need to. He simply stayed. Over time, a rhythm developed. The boy would rise early, even before Henry had finished making coffee, and find his place by Nico's side. Some mornings, he brought a book, though he never read from it. Other times, he brought nothing, just his presence. And Nico accepted it. The puppy who had almost frozen to death on the river no longer trembled when footsteps neared. He no longer winced when doors opened. When Lucas came near, Nico would breathe more deeply, like his body had found a kind of peace. They shared the silence not as a void, but as a space to heal in. Henry watched from the kitchen. He didn't interfere. He didn't ask questions. But every night, he added another log to the fire, made sure the floor was warm, and left the living room lamp on just a little longer. The boy still didn't speak. But for the first time in many months, he no longer looked lost. A week had passed. Nico had begun to walk again, his movements still stiff, his back leg favoring the memory of injury. He moved slowly through the house, trailing behind Lucas with a kind of quiet loyalty. He never strayed far. If Lucas sat by the window, Nico lay nearby. If Lucas wandered outside, Nico followed, his paws crunching gently over the hardened snow. Lucas had started spending more time near the river. The banks were frozen solid, the water beneath hidden under slabs of ice thick enough to hold a truck. He would stand there for long stretches, staring out at the white expanse. He never moved much, never kicked the snow or threw rocks. He just stood. And Nico stood beside him. The dog didn't bark. He didn't nudge for attention. He simply existed in the boy's silence. It was a stillness that didn't demand anything, that didn't try to fill space. He was just present. Henry Harris saw it. He watched from the porch, a book in one hand, coffee in the other. He didn't interrupt. Sometimes he read aloud into the open air, his voice soft, curling into the cold wind like smoke. He wasn't sure if the boy was listening or if Nico was, but it felt right to let the words exist where the silence lived. One afternoon, Harris paused mid-sentence. In the corner of his eye, he caught the boy's hand moving. Lucas reached toward Nico and rested it lightly on the dog's back. It was not hesitant. It was not forced. It was something else, something slow and honest, like ice beginning to shift under sunlight. Nico didn't react, didn't flinch or wag his tail. He simply allowed it, a quiet trust. It was the first touch Lucas had offered in months. That night, well after midnight, Henry stirred in bed to the sound of soft steps across the creaking wood floor. He slipped out of bed, opened his door just a crack, and saw the glow of the kitchen light. Lucas was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Nico lay beside him, head resting on the boy's lap. They didn't notice him. Lucas's head was tilted down, one hand stroking Nico's side slowly, rhythmically. Then, in the hush of the dark, Henry heard a whisper, faint, almost uncertain, but real. "You were waiting for someone too, weren't you?" No answer came, of course. Nico didn't lift his head. He only breathed deeply. A long exhale, as though something had loosened inside him. Henry didn't enter the room. He stepped back without a sound, let the light glow a little longer, and returned to bed with the image in his mind. Two souls thawing. Not from the cold outside, but from the cold they had carried within. By early February, the temperature had shifted. It was still winter, still the kind of cold that coated windows in breath and turned porch steps into glass. But the river was changing. Under the weight of the season's thaw, cracks had begun to form in the ice, small, almost imperceptible at first, like seams in fabric tugged loose by time. Locals said it was a sign of early melt. Some warned it would be dangerous near the water. Others just nodded and spoke about it like weather always was, inevitable, slow, and not to be argued with. Lucas started pointing toward the river every morning. He didn't speak. He never had since the fire. But each day, after breakfast, he'd sit by the door until Harris bundled them both in coats. Then the boy would walk ahead, Nico beside him, paws crunching in rhythm with the boy's boots. They would stop near the bend in the path that opened to the riverbank. Harris didn't ask questions. He watched from the edge, giving them space. On the 5th day of the new month, Harris came down with a fever. He sat wrapped in blankets, a mug of lemon water steaming in his hands, and told Lucas they'd have to skip the walk. Lucas didn't argue. He simply dressed himself, fastened Nico's leash, and left. When they returned, the sky had shifted colors. It was late afternoon, the kind of pale gold that only came through clouds. Lucas's jeans were soaked through at the knees, his boots dark with wet mud and river grit. There were scratches along the cuff of his coat, and something small clung to the fabric, a twig, snapped, bent. Harris opened the door and saw them in silence. Nico was covered in flecks of wet soil. His coat was matted, but his ears stood tall, alert, as if nothing had gone wrong. Lucas's cheeks were flushed. He smelled faintly of wet moss and cold iron. Across his shoulder, wedged into the strap of his backpack, was a thick branch, snapped on one end, like it had been used to pull or push something heavy. That evening, Harris heard the local news playing softly from the radio on the kitchen shelf. There was a report of a stray puppy, a small mixed breed that had fallen through the river ice near the South Bridge. A passerby had seen the tail end of the rescue. Just a boy and his dog, dragging the puppy out with a branch, and then disappearing down the road before anyone could stop them. The reporter called it quiet heroism. Harris turned off the radio and looked across the room. Lucas was sitting on the floor, legs stretched in front of him, Nico curled against his side. The boy's hand was resting around the dog's neck, not loose but firm, like he was holding on to something solid in a world that still felt fragile. They didn't notice him watching. Harris didn't speak. Later that night, when the house was quiet, Lucas walked into the kitchen. He didn't look at his uncle. He didn't sit. He just stood in the doorway for a moment and said the first full sentence anyone had heard from him in nearly a year. He knew where to go. His voice was soft, hoarse from disuse, but certain. It wasn't a story. It wasn't an explanation. It was just a truth, offered like a stone, laid gently on a table. Then he turned and went to bed, Nico trailing behind him, his paws silent on the old wood floor. Outside, the wind shifted again, and somewhere beneath the river's surface, another crack formed, this time not from weakness, but from change. After that winter afternoon by the river, things did not return to normal, because normal had never been enough. Instead, something shifted. Lucas began to speak. Not in full sentences at first, not in stories or explanations, but in pieces of words, short acknowledgments, soft affirmations spoken like pebbles dropped into still water. He looked people in the eyes. He nodded when called. He responded slowly but surely, as if relearning a language that had always lived somewhere inside his chest. At school, the difference was noticed. He sat closer to the other students. He didn't flinch at the sound of a chair scraping or a bell ringing. He wasn't suddenly extroverted, but he was present, no longer lost in the fog that had once seemed permanent. The silence that had wrapped around him like armor began to soften. And wherever he went, Nico was not far behind. The dog became part of their family, not by declaration, but by gravity. He simply stayed, as if the decision had already been made by something older than choice. The local vet added a note to his record, registered as emotional support animal. But in truth, Nico was more than that. He was a presence, a lighthouse, a silent translator between fear and calm. He didn't comfort with tricks or affection on command. He comforted with attention, with stillness, with the way he seemed to know where the weight was and how to sit just close enough to carry a part of it. Harris built a wooden doghouse in the backyard, insulated, painted, with a small brass plate above the door that read, Nico. But Nico never used it. Instead, every night, without exception, he settled just outside Lucas's bedroom door. He lay with his back to the wall and his nose pointed toward the hall, ears tilted to the slightest creak or breath. It became his place, not out of training, but instinct, like a soldier at post, like a memory refusing to fade. In the mornings, Lucas didn't wake up gasping. The nightmares came less often, and when they did, Nico was already there. His quiet breath, steady, grounding, they breathed in sync. The boy and the dog, one inhale, one exhale, like lanterns pulsing in the same storm. At school, Lucas was asked to write about something important to you. He turned in a piece with only one sentence. His handwriting was uneven, but the words were clear. He brought the light back. Harris read it later, alone, seated by the kitchen window. Outside, snow still clung to the edges of the porch, but the icicles were melting. The sun cut thin lines through the slats, casting shadows across the old floorboards. Nico lay nearby, his head resting on crossed paws, eyes closed, but not asleep. Harris reached out and gently touched the dog's ear. "You did," he whispered, though Nico made no sign he'd heard. Still, the man sat there a long time, warmed by the quiet. In the evenings, Harris sometimes caught Lucas humming to himself, soft and uncertain, while Nico walked beside him, their shadows stretching out together across the yard. No commands, no leashes, just a quiet understanding between a boy who once vanished into silence and a dog who knew how to wait. They didn't speak of healing, they didn't name the progress, but it happened all the same. One paw step, one word, one morning at a time, because some lights didn't shine loudly, some simply stayed on, even through the darkest nights. And Nico was that kind of light, the kind that stayed. When the snow melted and the ice finally broke away from the river, Harris took them both back to the same stretch of frozen water where Nico had first been found. The sky was open now, brushed with pale blue and thin clouds that moved slowly, as if in no hurry. The river, no longer silent and stiff, flowed with quiet purpose, carrying fragments of winter downstream. They walked without speaking, the boy, the man, and the dog. Nico walked ahead, his steps confident, no longer careful with pain. Lucas kept close behind, his jacket unzipped, his hand sometimes brushing Nico's back as if to remind himself that this was real. When they reached the spot, Harris stopped and pulled out a small camera. Nico stepped forward first. His paws sank slightly into the softened riverbank, just enough to touch the water's edge. Lucas stood beside him, one hand outstretched, not in command or caution, but in recognition. Neither of them looked at the camera. They both stared out across the water, where the horizon shimmered with a quiet warmth, the first promise of spring. Harris took a single photograph. Back at the house, he printed it in black and white, framed it in old wood, and hung it on the living room wall. Beneath it, he wrote in pen on the matting, "Some remain silent, not out of fear, but because they are waiting for someone who listens without needing words." Visitors to the house often paused in front of that picture. They'd ask questions sometimes, about the boy, about the dog, Harris would nod or shrug or offer a half story, but he rarely told the whole thing. Some stories were meant to be lived, not retold. Nico continued his morning ritual. Each day, just after dawn, he padded quietly to the front window. He sat there for a while, body still, ears relaxed, eyes fixed on the distant line where the trees met the water. He didn't whine. He didn't wait for anyone. He simply watched. Lucas grew taller. His voice steadied. The silences he carried became his own, no longer burdens but places of reflection. He still spoke little, but when he did, it was deliberate. And whenever someone asked him why he loved that dog so much, he would say only one thing. He didn't try to fix me. He just stayed. That spring, the river carried away the last remnants of ice. The fish returned to the shallows. Birds traced arcs above the waterline. And on a quiet morning in mid-April, Lucas opened the front door and Nico followed him down to the edge once again. They didn't need a reason. Because some places stay with you, not as pain, but as proof. And some bonds, once forged in cold and silence, never break. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter.